Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dissociative Identity Disorder, taking a deeper dive. So I've created a series of 3 videos, about 30 minutes each, just to give you an introduction to some aspects of DID. My name is Olga Trujillo, and I'm a survivor, an advocate, lawyer, author, and I've been doing this work for a really long time. And I was diagnosed with DID in 1993. So I'm gonna talk to you about DID from an inside out perspective. I'm gonna bring in kind of what we know about DID and then also provide some information from the perspective of someone who has it, who went through an extensive healing process and who's kind of learned how to move through the world as though I'm one for almost, wow, for a long time now, I'll just say. Okay, so I'm going to use a PowerPoint because I think it's going to be easier to show you a little bit about it. I also have a couple videos that I'm going to show you in the PowerPoint. And hopefully this will kind of help better understand a kind of complex mental health condition. All right, so bear with me while I find where my PowerPoint is on my screen. There it is. And okay, so DID is a severe psychiatric condition that is strongly correlated with a history of chronic and unremitting childhood abuse. And the disorder is characterized by identity alteration or confusion. So basically, if someone at a young age experiences trauma and ongoing trauma, and by I mean by a young age, before the age of 8 or 9, then they can hone in and utilize a creativity coping mechanism that they wouldn't have after the age of about 8 or 9. So you have the ability when you're young to create imaginary friends. And when you're in a situation where you're experiencing a lot of trauma and you can't escape it physically, then people who have DID have escaped it cognitively. And they've done it in this really creative manner because people like me will create parts of me inside. So that's where the identity alteration comes in. I created parts when I was abused so that I wouldn't know that that abuse was happening to me. And the more and more that I was abused, the more and more I created parts. And like I said, it's a really, really creative thing to do. And when you don't have another way of escaping abuse, that really helps. So, and DID involves a disruption of identity characterized by 2 or more distinct personality states. So, just to give you an idea, it's kind of rare for someone to have just 2 parts, as I call them. In fact, when I stopped counting, which was when I was in the healing process. So not when I was done, but when it got to be so many parts that I was a little bit afraid of it. I had 120 parts. And that's actually more the norm. And the more the number of parts someone has, the more severe the trauma was. So for me, they weren't all full-fledged, what I call full-fledged parts. And I'll show you in a video, there are different types of parts. There are parts that are apparently normal people, which are kind of what I called full-fledged parts, right? So, and then there are parts that are emotions or fragments or just hold sensations and smells and things like that. So, and those are called EPs, emotional part of the personality. So it gives you an idea, right? And so one of the key factors for determining whether someone has DID or not is that they may have parts, right? And they may have this abuse that happened in the past, but also they have these recurrent gaps in recall of everyday events. And that those gaps are not consistent with ordinary forgetting. So for example, when I was in my late 20s and people would ask me about my childhood, I would say to them that I had a really happy childhood, but I didn't remember most of it. And what I remembered was things that I did in school, things that I did playing sports and playing with friends. But what I didn't remember were the things that were happening in my home. So those are recurrent gaps, right, that aren't normal forgetting. That is, you don't remember everything outside of your home and forget everything inside your home unless there's trauma involved. And that would be the reason that I would have that kind of gap. So I'm hoping that helps. So it's that piece of but having these blanks, these blocks of time in your childhood or in the past where you don't have any recollection, that's not normal. And then the feeling the, having parts basically, and then having there be abuse. Now, when I was diagnosed, I didn't know I had been abused. I actually, like I said, thought I had a happy childhood. And let me just stop share for a second. I was having what I thought were panic attacks. I went to see a movie, and in the movie, there was the beginning of the movie had this really vivid attempted rape scene. And that started a series of panic attacks for me, what I thought were panic attacks, which were actually flashbacks. At that point, I went to get help, and it was through kind of figuring out whether that had happened before, like tying the scene in the movie to the fact that I didn't have good memory of my childhood, kind of started opening a possibility that DID was an issue for me. Okay, so I want to show you, I'm going to share my screen again, and I want to show you a video that I love because it's about people with DID, from people who have DID. And it's a fairly short video. It's about 8 minutes. I'm gonna fast forward through the very, very first minute or so of the video because it's a fundraiser. And that was, anyway, that fundraiser is over, but this is the only video, the copy of the video that I have. So this video is called the I Am We video. And this was a movie, a documentary that was being presented. So, okay.
My name is Ron Davis, and I'm...
All right, so I'm gonna fast forward through this part. And he's a really nice guy, and he talks about why he's doing the film. And the main thing here is that he's not exploiting the symptoms, but actually talking about the causes, which is unusual.
Bad movies portray this disorder as the ground out of which murderers emerge and torturers emerge.
We couldn't possibly be normal or have normal lives or jobs or children that are functioning.
They thought if I prayed more or if I had another baptism, that these spirits would just be released from my body.
Someplace between 3 and 9 million Americans have this disorder.
It could be anyone.
person sitting next to you.
We have DID.
I am we. We have DID. I am we.
Hi, welcome to Healing Together. Here's your name tag. And then this is the folder that has your agenda. DID is an acronym that stands for Dissociative Identity Disorder. Most people in the past called it multiple personality disorder. It's one word of a difference, but it's a big difference. We're not multiple people. We're one person with multiple parts. And I think the new name reflects that better. Everybody has a social self, a work self, a weekend self, a husband self, a wife self. Everyone has self states. People with dissociative identity disorder, they dissociate those states. So instead of being congruent and all aligned, they're separated. So while your work self will know your home self, will know your school self, you'll be all interconnected. People who dissociate have those selves, but they don't communicate with each other.
Different people have different labels for how they view their system. For example, a person may look at their system as their people, whereas someone else may say my parts, whereas another person may say my personalities.
Each individual person held an integral part of my life. I have a part that was a secret keeper, a part that helped me in school achieve straight A's, a part that is my protector, that when boundaries are crossed, you will know. For me, it's easy to live with voices inside. The hard part is accepting the reality. This is why I have it.
Many of these patients who prominently experience dissociative symptoms have had the experience of chronic childhood abuse and neglect during their early years. And that's a key. DID is a trauma disorder, similar, if you will, to post-traumatic stress disorder. Most folks with DID also have post-traumatic stress disorder. Study after study after study has shown that people with dissociative identity disorder report histories of very traumatic childhoods, sexual abuse, physical abuse, a lot of neglect. And what happens is when children are being abused at a certain window of vulnerability age, between about maybe 4 and 7 or 8, when children are still forming their identities and have this sort of capacity to imagine not being themselves. Some children make use of this capacity and personify these difficult thoughts and feelings so that when I get angry, it's not me, I'm a good little girl. It's a boy and his name is, Rascal or something. And he can come out and be mad when I can't be. It is an internal sense of self that feels very disconnected. It feels very other because it feels too dangerous for those thoughts and those feelings to be integrated into your sense of identity.
There are huge blocks in their memory that just don't exist. Could be hours, could be days even. So there's amnesia for the time that other personalities are out.
When this happens over and over and over again, it becomes your way of being. It continues to feel real. DID doesn't go away with the pill. DID takes many years of slow and careful treatment to try to help people reintegrate back these aspects of self, asking themselves the questions, what purposes do these parts of me serve? Which is hard.
There's times that I've been frightened of my people. They wanted to hurt me for a long time. Therapy has been one of the greatest things that we have ever done. I would like all of you to come close to me. Enjoy this with me. Some of my people that were the most scary just needed love and understanding. And when we started working in that direction, everything started to change. I want to learn about them. They all have different interests, different hobbies, different skill sets. They saved my life for years.
The narrative of Willow's life has holes in it because the different people hold on to different memories. So she does not have a cohesive, coherent timeline of her life. The goal of her therapy is to be able to put the pieces together to make sense of the things that she went through. So she has the same story as her people, and her people have the same story as her.
Mine?
So I love this video. Let me just stop share for a second. I love this video, again, because it's people who have DID talking about it. But there's a couple of things that I want to point out. So first of all, when Jamie was talking about, Jamie is an infinite, the head of an infinite mind. It's a really, it's a good nonprofit, and it puts on this amazing conference every year called the Healing Together Conference that brings together people who have DID, clinicians who work with people with DID, and the people who support people with DID. And oftentimes those are people coming in teams, and sometimes it's individuals coming from those different groups. And it's just kind of a one-of-a-kind conference. This year it's going to be virtual, and it'll be the end of January, beginning of February. But it's always that first weekend in February. So keep an eye out for it if you want to learn more. It's the Healing Together Conference put on by An Infinite Mind. So Jamie talked about that, and she talked about how we all have parts, but with people who don't have DID, there's no separation between the parts. They communicate with each other. Like you're a whole person, right? For someone like me, for Jamie, she said, she had all these parts, but they didn't talk to each other. So for me, it was a little bit different. The parts of me that were abused, that took the abuse, and that knew about the abuse, and their roles were related to what had happened to me and making sure that I didn't find out. Those parts I didn't know about. They didn't share information. It was just darkness, basically. The parts of me that I created to function every day, to do really well, to try to try to do things well enough that I could feel good about myself. Those parts of me I created and kept an opening between them. So I created basically an imaginary house in my head. And the parts that were abused and that I didn't know about, they lived in the back of the house in different rooms that I painted black and locked the door. And the people that were helping me function every day were in the front of the house. And I left those doors open and painted the rooms bright colors, had big windows in them. It was really bright, and there was a hallway. And this is all very imaginative, right? It's all very, very creative to do this. But because I left the doors open and the hallway, they shared information with each other. So I wasn't losing track of time when I wasn't abused. I was only losing track of time when I was abused. And that's a big distinction because it helped me to survive and thrive a little bit better than if I was losing track of time all the time. So, which some people do. So I wanted to point out that there is a little bit of a distinction there. There are other people like me that have co-consciousness, is what it's called, when parts can talk to each other, but not among the whole, all the parts inside. Okay, so I'm hoping that makes sense. This next video that I'm going to show you is a really nice video. The way that it has illustrative how DID forms. And I like it because of the visual. A lot of people have a better time understanding it when they can see something visually. So, and this is the one that talks about apparently normal parts of the person and emotional parts of the person. So, so anyway, let me show you that, and then I'll kind of tell you where I am in that context. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. Here's the video, and okay. So the person on this video has a bit of an accent, and I'm hoping that you can still understand her.
In a sufficiently safe environment that is sensitive to child's needs, the human personality develops wholly. In other words, life experiences are integrated into the consciousness. When trauma occurs in childhood, that is when the nervous system is going through a phase of rapid development, it always results in a dissociative disorder of some degree. This means that the traumatizing experiences must be separated from everything else. In other words, the personality is divided, dissociated, and the traumatic experience is encapsulated. The part that is carrying the traumatic experience is called EP, emotional part of the personality. Because the unbearable experience has been separated from the personality, it is no longer whole. Therefore, the remaining part is called ANP, apparently normal part of the personality. The main purpose for the ANP is to keep on living as if nothing ever happened, and the encapsulated EP is stuck in the trauma time. The more chronic traumatization and dissociation is, the more complicated the fragmentation of the personality structure will become. One part may bear the pain experience or the physical feeling. The second part carries the picture of the event, and the third part the sound. One cannot recall the traumatic memory by will, but it is triggered by a reminder of the trauma. Usually, a traumatic memory is triggered just partially. Some fragment of it reaches the consciousness. Sometimes it might activate wholly. This is called a flashback. Depending on how early the traumatization begins and the severity of it, the greater the likelihood is that the ANP is also divided. The dissociative identity disorder, also called as DID, means that there are more than one ANP sharing the everyday life of the individual.
Okay, so let me kind of put this a little bit in context for you, and let me stop share. So when I was 3 years old, that's the first memory I have of being sexually abused in my home. And I split off. So I created basically EPs and put those in a room. Okay. And then when it happened again, and then it happened again, then I started to create different ANPs, right? Apparently normal parts of the personality. And then I put more and more of those EPs into the different rooms that I had. And some of them also went with apparently normal parts of the personality, but parts that were being abused, if that makes sense. So when I stopped counting, so in the process of healing, I was counting the different parts that I had. And then, you know, not just counting them, but identifying who they were and what their roles were and kind of really keeping track. And then when I got to about 120, I started getting kind of scared and feeling defeated. Like, this is just a lot. So I stopped keeping track of how many I had. I still kept figuring out who they were, what the roles were, that kind of thing. Meeting them, learning to appreciate, have compassion, and really, I mean, realize that I was alive today and functioning because I did this and created these parts inside me. And so when I stopped counting, I had 120 parts, and roughly I had 20 A and Ps and about 100 EPs. And those were different kinds of EPs. Some of them were a little bit more formed and some of them were less formed. Some of them would be an object that I was staring at when I was abused. Some of it might be a smell, but a lot of them were, you know, a little bit more formed parts of me. So I'm not sure if that helps. In the process of healing, I have basically, if you think I have like 120 or more actually parts, in the process of healing, as the therapist said in the previous video, it's not to get rid of your parts. That's not the goal of healing. The goal of healing is to meet who's inside, get people to talk to each other inside, and then have a narrative of what happened to you so that you can move through the world safer and you know, and move through the world and build a happy, healthy life. So that's the purpose of healing. And that's only if you decide that's what you want in terms of healing. Some therapists will say the purpose of healing is to get rid of parts. It's not effective. Parts do not want to hear that you want to get rid of them. Just really honestly, you start having a problem inside when you do that. Now, in the process of healing, I had parts that didn't have roles anymore and that really didn't want to be around anymore. So they became part of me, most of me. So if you think about me, let's pretend I have like 120 plus, you know, fingers around, being kind of like this. Now I'm more like this. So there is still separation, but it's not this kind of separation. It's an awareness that there are parts inside. We, as long as I pay attention to my thoughts and pay attention to how my body feels and make decisions based on that, then I keep my people inside, you know, kind of working together. And so that allows me to move through the world as though I am one, even though I'm not one. So, so I'm hoping that that helps an understanding of DID and kind of what the goals a person might have if they go into a process of healing. All right. So why do I want you to know all this? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again because it's really important to me that people know about this. Okay. It's because it exists. And for many years, there has been a determined effort to undermine the diagnosis and undermine the people who have been working with survivors who have DID. But it does exist, and there are a number of studies that show that this exists. And it's important that you know this because we it was Robert Oxnam in the video that said that I think 2 to 9 million people in the US have DID. Those are the ones that we know about. So right now there's an estimate of 1 to 3% of people in the US have DID. And the problem is if you come in contact with people, which if you think about it, if you're trying to help people who are adult survivors of child sexual abuse, you're working with people who have experienced trauma as children, and they may have coped by creating parts like I did, and they might not know it. Like I didn't know it when I started having those panic attacks when I saw that movie. I was lucky that I ended up seeing someone that knew what this was and knew how to work with it. And the thing is with that help, it can create chaos and risk for people who have DID. And it can also, for people like me who've gone through a process of healing and kind of moved through the world as if we're on, it can create additional challenges in a crisis. If a new trauma or loss, it can create a problem for me where I might find it difficult to move through the world as one, that my parts might start kind of pulling apart and arguing and creating problems for me. So it's important that you know that it exists, why it comes up, what it means for someone, because then when you're working with someone, it may give you a better sense of what might be happening for them. Instead, what people do when they come across someone that has DID, if they don't know that DID is a real thing, they are very suspicious of the person that has DID, and they don't get good services or responses. And that's my big worry. I want people to get good services and responses. So, okay. So let me talk a little bit about, in the little bit of time that we have left, about what it feels like inside. All right. So if you haven't seen this movie, I would recommend that you see this movie, because it is a lot like this. Like, I swear the person that did this movie has DID, because it is a lot like this. So what you have is you have a person, and by the way, a person would have way more parts than this. And they would be, not just specific feelings like in this one. They might be inanimate objects, they could be animals, different genders. People are super creative. Like, I actually was not very creative. Most all of my parts were me at different ages. But some other people are like way more creative. So the way that it feels inside is that people have what they feel are voices in their heads. And that's important. It's in their heads. Okay, now for me, it wasn't voices. It felt like thoughts. And I think that was in part because all those parts that I created were me. And somehow those felt like thoughts rather than voices. And I've met other people who have DID who also feel like they have just a whole bunch of thoughts and they can't control them. It feels like you're busy inside. I attended a conference, that Healing Together conference, and I saw a really amazing presentation for people who don't have DID to help them understand what their partners or friends or family might feel like having DID. And so what they did was they had this person sit down, and they had 4 or 5 people kind of stand around them and talking to them in their heads, basically. So they were saying all kinds of stuff. But the whole time, that person was trying to interact with another person to fill out a form. And they found it really difficult. And I have to say, it wasn't as chaotic as it is for a lot of people that have DID. So it's really busy inside. For me, I'll just say it's not as busy inside because I have cohesiveness. I have if I'm not paying attention to my thoughts, if I'm just doing things without taking into account how everyone inside feels, then I'll start having more voices, more busyness inside, disruption. I'll have physical pain as well, to try to let me know that they don't feel safe doing this. But like I said, I've been doing this almost 30 years now, and I've got it down to a science. Unless there's some kind of, new trauma or crisis, I move through the world pretty seamlessly. It can be really chaotic for people. It's hard to be planful and proactive. So you feel like you're reacting to things all the time because you're just seeing what's in front of you all the time, because you're not carrying through, because you're switching from part to part to respond to whatever's going on around you. It's really hard for people to concentrate. So it's all a lot of the same things that we see then with post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so the other pieces of it is the whole dissociation piece, which is constantly there for people who have DID. It's the way that I moved through the world, was constantly dissociating. So I had a sense of being detached from my body all the time. I had changing perceptions of people or surroundings because I was switching. And also, yeah, mostly because I was switching. And trust is a huge issue for people who grow up in homes where they've been abused. So you lose trust in people relatively quickly. You feel like you're incapable of doing anything. And this is really striking to me when I think back. I was diagnosed, I was the youngest general counsel at the US Department of Justice. I graduated in the top third of my law school class. I graduated college, fine and everything. So, I mean, I had accomplished quite a bit despite the fact that I had DID, despite the fact that I had this really awful childhood. But I didn't know any of that. And I felt completely incapable because things felt harder to me than it seemed like things were for the people around me. So people with DID have a lot of that. And it's very hard to control your thoughts. And in fact, what I did most of the time was to ignore my thoughts and just deal with what was in front of me. And that takes a lot of work, to just ignore all those voices in your head. And then again, I could not control how disconnected I felt to everything and everyone in my world. And I didn't think about it. I just kind of moved through the world. And it wasn't until I started having those panic attacks that it kind of stopped me. So, okay. So I'm going to stop there. This is the end of segment 1, DID, taking a deeper dive. And I'm hoping that that helps. And there's 2 other videos. The second video is on the healing process, because I think it's important for you to know about that. And the third video is on what this means for your work. So how do you work with someone who has DID? So thanks very much, and I hope this is helpful.